My Fellow Americans by Martin Ison. Chapter 4. You cannot go there, Will. You have to leave it alone. Vice President Waylander was wringing his hands in despair. This is exactly what he had wanted to speak to President Cutter about. When those two spics had wheedled their way into an audience with the President behind my back, what the hell did these people think this was? A local lawyer's office, for Christ's sakes? Will Cutter was far too soft to be a proper president. He will never, ever win through by doing all this Robin Hood stuff. Business is where the real power is, and business can't function if you're not prepared to break a few eggs. So it's a shame about Mrs. What's-her-face and her little immigrant family. But where the hell else are we going to get the energy we need to run this godforsaken country? Then there's this. Talk about playing with fire. Naturally, Waylander kept his thoughts to himself as he sat on the facing couch in the Oval Office and listened to Will Cutter hold his course, perched on the edge of his desk, looking far too at home if you ask me. J. Merlin, the President's Director of Communications, sat on the couch opposite. He steepled his long bony fingers deep in thought, listening, analysing. The President shrugged his shoulders. Well, thanks for caring, George, but I'm getting rather tired of reminding you who exactly is President around here. For your knowledge and information, I shall go wherever it pleases me to go. And if it means reopening a 9/11 inquiry to put everyone's mind at rest, then so be it. But there's already been an inquiry, Will. NASA's already done that. That box has been well and truly ticked. Waylander knew this for a fact. As a senator at the time, he himself had lodged some not too delving questions to the CEO of the National Association of Standards in Science and Technology's 9/11 committee. Everyone knew its inquiry had been under-resourced and, at best, cursory. Never an investigative organisation, NASST, or NAST, was only ever meant as a measurement standards laboratory, a non-regulatory agency at the Department of Commerce. Nothing to do with law enforcement or investigation. It had never carried out an investigation in its lifetime, let alone one this important. The World Trade Center terrorist attack of September the 11th, 2001 had global repercussions, the effects of which reverberated around the world and could be felt for many decades to come. For the first time since they had started the meeting over an email Cutter had sent to Merlin and that had subsequently been passed on to Waylander, Merlin spoke. George is right, Mr. President. As well-meaning and principled though your motives may be, this move would play havoc in the national press, the world press even. Merlin displaced his glasses with his fingers to rub the inside corners of his eyes. To open a new investigation into something that took place 20 years ago would be political suicide. It would open old wounds for the American public who would rather just forget and just carry on with their lives. President Cutter paused and considered what Jay had said. True, 9/11 had been nearly 20 years ago. Many men and women of voting age had not even been born in 2001, and many who were middle-aged and older at the time were now deceased. So why bother about it now? Wasn't it just history? But this was 2020, and President William Cutter was still fresh in office. 2021 was just a short time away, and it was to be the year that marked the 20th anniversary of that fateful day when 3,000 Americans had perished at the hands of ruthless murderers. It was the day the world changed. From that day onward, America had flexed its formidable military muscles and overran first Afghanistan, then Iraq, then Libya, then Syria, and now Lebanon, with Iran sometime very soon, notwithstanding Russian involvement. This just could not go on. The Middle East had long become a quagmire. If the media covered anything like the true reality of the death and destruction that was really taking place there, the public would be outraged. Trouble was, the public was already outraged, thanks to social media creating awareness that the mainstream media had been hiding all these years. Cutter had promised a resolution to the continuous wars, the constant convoy of body bags being flown home, But worse was the unreported deaths of servicemen and women. Few people realised that between 2000 and 2018, the US had suffered 5,273 military deaths. But during that same period, 128,480 returning US veterans had committed suicide. This was in addition to the many thousands, arguably millions of innocent civilian deaths across the Middle East. Deaths that were fueling the hatred leading to radicalisation and further terrorist atrocities around the world. Enough was most certainly enough. William Cutter aimed to be the President of Peace. Had that not been his campaign pledge, he would not be sitting here in the Oval Office right now. On William Cutter's watch, there was to be a 20-year commemoration for those who died on 9/11. In the months running up to the tribute, the flames of conspiracy theory would be fanned once again, harder this time, corresponding to the size of the memorial event. All the unanswered questions would once again be asked. Why was NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, rendered virtually dysfunctional that day? Why were the airliners not intercepted by the Air Force in the world's most heavily guarded airspace? Why did the towers collapse so neatly into their own footprint at free-fall speed as if by controlled demolition? Why did the third building, called WTC-7, a 52-storey skyscraper, collapse, again so neatly as if demolished, although it had not been hit by an aircraft? Why are most people not even aware of this third building collapse? Why was all the wreckage impounded and kept away from investigators? How did the BBC come to mistakenly report on the collapse of the third building nearly 15 minutes before it actually fell? What happened to the $2.3 trillion that Donald Rumsfeld announced had gone missing from the Pentagon the very day before it was struck by an aircraft, coincidentally taking out the finance and computing section of the Pentagon building? Why was there no aircraft wreckage on the lawn? How did an untrained terrorist manage to fly such a tight corkscrew manoeuvre to specifically hit that part of the building when seasoned Boeing 757 pilots said that this was virtually impossible to achieve? Why aim for such a low-lying building when the White House or the Capitol buildings were within sight, both easier and more important targets in terms of a terrorist achievement? The questions had been relentless and remained unanswered to that day. The sheer weight of suspicion meant that the unpatriotic tinfoil hat wearer accusation in response to seeking the truth was wearing thin. Many of those raising the questions were highly qualified scientists, architects, engineers, and security experts. Now most of America owned a tinfoil hat. They had ironically become a fun fashion accessory available on Amazon. Society was pushing back against recent laws, making questioning the government's official version of 9/11 a criminal act of subversion. However, no arrests had yet been made. How could they? It would necessitate a court hearing to delve into whether the claims being made by the defendant were in fact subversive or true, and that simply could not happen. A British man once refused to pay his TV licence on the grounds that the BBC had broken a clause of its own royal charter, stating that it would always operate within the law. He had argued that the BBC must have had prior knowledge of the attack to report part of it before it actually happened, and thus had been criminally colluding with terrorists. His case was promptly dropped. Out of the glare of the spotlight, the BBC changed the wording of its charter to avoid further such cases. It was President Cutter's plan to lance this boil of doubt, to hold a proper inquiry and, in the spirit of openness, share the results with the public, no matter how hard it was going to be. The truth had to prevail to create a better and safer world for everyone. As far as Will Cutter was concerned, confidence in government had to be rebuilt or anarchy would quickly follow. Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jay, but we have to stop treating the American people like children. They're tired of it. The reason why they voted for me is because I promised a shakedown of business as usual politics. But they've heard all that before. Yes, Jay, they have, from Donald Trump and his cohorts. And as we know, nothing happened. In fact, everything got worse. Trump increased the thirst for change and never delivered. But in doing so, he increased the appetite for honesty and truthfulness to the extreme. And that's what I'm going to deliver. It's what I must deliver. I owe it to the people. Waylander could hardly contain his frustration. He rose and began pacing the room. President Cutter continued. Democracy itself is in the last chance saloon, and the electorate's faith in the country's leadership is at an all-time low. A 9/11 inquiry, a proper one, leaving no stones unturned, cannot harm us politically. It didn't even take place on our watch. We could end up by discrediting the Republicans for good. It could guarantee me a second term. Waylander and Merlind made fleeting eye contact, which didn't escape the president as he continued. But as it stands, we're on the verge of a total collapse of economy, of trust, of order. Do you want to see rioting in the streets? No, Will. Do you? Waylander erupted. And what the hell does that mean? Waylander sighed and paused for a moment. He realised that his passions were getting the better of him. It was time to step into his calm and cajoling Waylander persona. Mr. President, Will, I agree. Yes, questions will be answered. And you're right, there do seem to be too many aspects of the 9/11 story that, perhaps, don't stack up. Only a fool would say otherwise. The country was taken entirely by surprise. We realised then just how exposed we were to a potential unthinkable attack. It was because it was unthinkable that the American nation became so complacent. But if you reopen the sores of 9/11 and have this inquiry, you'll go down as America's first crackpot conspiracy theories president. Don't you see, Will? It's your reputation I'm thinking of. My reputation or yours? Cutter shot back. Waylander was visibly ruffled at the comment. Nobody's talking about me being a conspiracy theorist, George. I'm not creating theories. I'm merely suggesting we have a retrospective public inquiry to close the case for good. As you said, it was nearly 20 years ago. There's nothing for anyone to hide anymore, is there? There was a long pause as the question hung heavily in the air. Then Waylander checked his watch. Look, Will, if I can't persuade you, maybe there's someone else who can. I've taken the liberty of inviting someone to this meeting who might be able to help you understand. They should be here right now, if you're willing to see them. Waylander had been waiting for this opportunity to introduce his two guests to the meeting. They could perhaps convince the president of the implications of opening Pandora's box. He opened the door leading to Judith Southgate's office and asked her to show the two visitors in. Cutter raised his eyebrows. He recognised one of them instantly. Built like an NFL linebacker, Hadley Armstrong cut an unusual figure for a director of the CIA. Simply being in the same room as him was an intimidating experience. Softly spoken and supremely self-confident, he cut a charismatic figure who spoke his mind and was at ease with facing down anyone who might stand in his way. Armstrong wore a dark blue suit, expertly tailored for his size, that made him look as formidable as he was sharply dressed. The other man seemed much more enigmatic to Cutter. In his mid-60s, the slightly built, dark-skinned man appeared Middle Eastern. He had brown, world-weary eyes reflecting deep intellect like watery pools. His short hair was turning closer to grey than its original black, and he appeared uncomfortable in the lounge suit, along with pale blue shirt minus tie. You can tell a man who's not used to wearing a suit, thought Cutter. It's in the way he moves. The man's face looked vaguely familiar. He held Cutter's attention momentarily with a supremely confident gaze. A leader of men? Cutter just could not place where he'd seen the man before as he shook hands with both men and bade them sit. He surveyed the four men in the room. Well, this is becoming quite a party. How's the war going, Hadley? Cutter smiled. Which one? The one nearest the top of your in tray. The president was referring to the constant power play between the different organizations that made up America's security community. The CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, the United States Secret Service. There was a squabbling federation of 16 different government agencies working separately and occasionally together to broker intelligence, gain and retain power, and, lest anyone forget, to keep the country safe. This last point always seemed like an afterthought to Cutter. The US security community's budget was astronomical, now standing at $55 billion. The funding apportioned to the security services had doubled after 9/11 and grown steadily since. 70% of it went to private contractors. That's a lot of fortunes made for some very wealthy CEOs. Security had become an economy of its own that would make a small country salivate, and that was before adding America's monumental defense spending, larger than that of all the other countries of the world combined. NSA, replied Armstrong carefully. But we're still friends. A similar budget to theirs wouldn't go amiss, though, Mr. President. There would be no chance. President Cutter was about to prove correct the rumours about cuts to security and defence budgets, but that was a conversation for another time. Armstrong and his colleagues had been fully briefed that the President was planning to open a 9/11 truth inquiry, and regardless of any supposed conspiracy theories, there were still reputations to be protected. Given that they had the kind of multi-billion-dollar budgets that other departments could only dream of, it seemed reprehensible that the CIA, FBI and all the other security organisations seemed, on that fateful day, to fail at what they were supposed to be best at: security. As they debated the subject, it became clear to Cutter that, even without starting a new retrospective inquiry, everything was not quite as it seemed during those 9/11 attacks. The question was not so much whether holding the inquiry was the right thing to do. It was more about what might be unravelled. Hadley Armstrong's associate had waited and listened patiently, and finally decided to contribute to the conversation. May I make a suggestion? Of course, Mr. President Cutter paused. You know, I don't think I was told your name. Charles El Amin. And where are you from, Mr. El Amin? I don't seem to be able to place your accent. I can't make out if it's Arabic or South American. El Amin glanced at Armstrong, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then continued. You are very perceptive, Mr. President. El Amin bowed his head slightly in respect. The real answer is, I'm from many places. I was originally born in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and lived there for some time. Cutter noted the separated syllable pronunciation of Saudi in common with all those who knew the region. I have lived and work in Brazil for many years with my family. I feel more Brazilian than Saudi these days. He smiled warmly. And what exactly is your line of work? Analyst. Cutter turned to Armstrong and laughed wryly. Why are your people always called analysts, Hadley? Because they are, and Charles is one of our best. You don't want to know what projects he's been involved in. In fact, most of the time, it's best that you don't know, said Armstrong. It's why we're here. Waylander and Merlin were anxious to know what El Amin had to say to the President, although they had a good idea what it was about. Merlin urged him to get to the point. El Amin continued, In Arabic, we have a saying that goes, La tuakis aresat al-naim. It means simply, do not awaken the sleeping lion. My question is this. Suppose you went ahead with your inquiry. Would that which you would gain be greater or lesser in value than that which you might stand to lose? What we would gain, Mr. Al-Amin, said President Cutter, fixing the man with his gaze, is a long-awaited closure for the American people and, should any further incriminating evidence be uncovered, a last opportunity to bring to justice those people and organisations who may have assisted Al-Qaeda directly or indirectly through negligence, regardless of who they are. El-Amin returned Cutter's gaze with his brown, watery eyes and said, "You cannot kill a man when he's already dead, Mr. President." Cutter gasped. A chill travelled down his spine as El-Amin told his story. Cutter now realised exactly who he was. 20 years older, but unmistakable. The only thing missing was a long greying beard and an Afghani mountain dweller's robes. A man who had returned from a watery grave. Will Cutter's mind was cast back to 2011 when Navy SEAL Team 6 had apprehended and killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, then allegedly dumped his corpse into the sea, leaving no evidence of the body. A few weeks later, all the members of SEAL Team 6 were killed in a freak helicopter accident in Afghanistan. It was to be on this day that President William Cutter, just as those before him, was to hear the complete truth about exactly what happened on that day of September the 11th, 2001. He heard all the details of what came before and afterwards, a truth that was to create a weight in his heart and add years to his brow. This was the beginning of his initiation, the day he received the contents of the whole Book of Secrets. Not a physical book, but an understanding of the reality of the world, how it really works, and what was expected of him to help perpetuate the system. This was the legendary knowledge which every president received and to which they would add during their tenure in the Oval Office. A metaphoric scrapbook of corruption, conspiracy and vested interest that would remain a secret on pain of death. It was the day that Will Cutter realised that being the President of the United States of America was not the job that he had thought it would be. For the first time, he felt less of a US President and more of an unwilling frontman for the world's most powerful mafia organisation. That was My Fellow Americans by Martin Ison. Chapter 4. Coming up in Chapter 5, during a presidency that's turning into his own worst nightmare and against his conscience and all his principles, Will Cutter must sanction a drone strike. You can purchase all 38 chapters of this audiobook on Audible, Amazon and iTunes. Printed and Kindle versions also available. Don't forget to like and leave your thoughts in the message box below, because the author would love to know your opinion.